just a moment too. Thank you, George, very much. This was a kind of a thing that happened over Facebook, and lots of things happened over Facebook. But he was actually cordial enough, and I have to say this: thank you for accommodating my crazy schedule. Us communicating back and forth is not an easy task for me. So, but we got here, and we're doing good. Let me figure this out. Oh, I saved it. Okay, let's try that. Let's see what happens. Excellent. Okay, so whenever you're ready, brother.
Okay, go ahead, bud.
All right, so the thank yous are said, and now we're going to get down to discussing the scriptures here. And his slide, the last one, looks like says there is no physical resurrection. Well, here's the problem with George's argument. And it's the same problem as with his proposition. The problem is that is not the topic in 1 Corinthians 15. I kind of figured this is where he'd be going. So I want to illustrate to you that 1 Corinthians 15 is not talking about physical resurrection. It's talking about the death of Adam, which he so kindly brought up for us, and we're going to talk about that. But the reason that we go this route, thinking that it's some physical resurrection, is because that's what you were told. That's what the Catholic doctrine taught us all of these years ago. And Holger made a good point earlier in our discussions that they brought in original sin, they also brought in original death. Let's think about this from a logical standpoint. We're going to talk about that as we go through this, but I would simply want to make the first point about this, that George's proposition is not found in the scriptures. George, so turnabout's fair play. I'm going to ask you a question. Since I answered yours, you get to answer one of mine. And you can just answer, nod yes or no if you want. Is there any place in the scriptures that uses those terms, bodily resurrection or physical resurrection?
We just read it.
You can't find it. And I'll let you show us that. Bodily resurrection, physical resurrection. What we do see are terms like out of the dead, eknekron, out of the dead ones. We see that every time that this idea is used, it's in the plural sense. So here's what I want to do is I'm just going to start with this right away, maybe. And this isn't going to work, of course. Let's look here at 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 12. If you look at the Young's literal, it says, and Christ has preached that out of the dead. Now, if you look at this, it's an adjective, and it is in the plural. Let's try it. Now it's working. Well, either way, we see this, that is in the plural. And this is out of the dead. So this is out of the dead ones. So this isn't saying that Jesus rose from the dead. What this is saying, if we look at the original words, that Jesus rose out of the dead ones, eknekron. And when we see this here, it's plural. How do we get around these words? I'm going to show you something else here in just a moment about the usage of this if we get time. If not here, it will be in the next one. And this is going to be a real problem for my good brother to deal with, because all of these statements illustrate that this is something that's taking place in present time. The whole thing is written in present time. What we have to remember is that Paul was writing to people 2,000 years ago. Hey, folks, this is somebody else's mail. This is not my mail. I'm reading letters written to them. And what we are looking at is this information that goes to them, not us. It was written for our learning, of course, throughout the ages. We know that. That's God's eternal purpose, Ephesians chapter 3. That's part of it. But we also know that this was written to them and not us. So how do we take these things and apply this stuff to us? It's disingenuous. And we have been sold a bill of goods starting in the first century with this great falling away that Paul told Timothy was going to happen. And that's how we have got to this place. The church fell away immediately. There was a great persecution. Jesus even said, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on earth? Are we going to take that literal in the futuristic standpoint and say, oh, well, hey, that means that And I remember hearing Christians say this in Bible studies. I remember my own dad saying this one time. We were talking when I was just a little kid. That as long as there's at least one Christian on the earth, Jesus won't return. That this is how far we take this. You see where I'm going with that? And that's not the case. You see, the fact of the matter is that Christ came to redeem us from sin in our souls. It's our souls that is going to be saved or lost or perish. It's not our physical body. Our physical body returns to the dust. Isn't that what God promised? Or do we not believe in the promises of God? Because we go all the way back to the death of Adam, and we say to ourselves, well, God certainly didn't mean what he said there in the garden, did he? And if God didn't mean what he said in the garden, then he certainly didn't mean what he said when he was going to come back soon, and that can be billions of years, if not 2,000. We don't take God at his word, and it's time for the Lord's people to start taking God at his word. And now let's look at see what God said. You know, in Genesis, let's go over here to Genesis chapter 3. I want to show you something here that I think maybe you might have overlooked. But I need to water. So in Genesis 3, we see that Eve was the first one to fall, right? A serpent came to her and said to Eve, you're not going to die. But before this, God had said, you will surely die. Look at the second chapter, verse 15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. And verse 16, he said, God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. God said, do not eat of that tree. And did they believe him? Yes, they believed God when he said, don't eat of the tree. But then God said, the day you eat of that, you will surely die. In dying, you shall die. And what does that Hebrew term mean? Well, I think the simplest way to put this is, Adam, you're dying, but the day you eat of that, you will surely die. Now, how did he die the day that he ate of that? Well, we know it wasn't physical because Adam, when Eve came up to him and said, hey, this is pretty good, you ought to try it. What did he do? He took a look at it. He said, are you sure? He took a bite of it, and he still was standing. Now, there were two teachings, my brother, in the garden that day. God said, the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. But the serpent gave the popular teaching that's still being taught today. That the day you eat of it, you shall surely not die. Now, which one has the church of Christ adopted today? The teaching of the serpent or the teaching of God? I'm going to go with God. I don't know about you all. But as for me and myself, and I'm going to teach my house what the Lord said and to follow that. The death of Adam happened that day, and it was a spiritual death. Now, how do we know that it was spiritual? Because he had the tree of life in the midst of the garden. He could eat of that, and he could live. Now, we see that God told him, or said, we're going to have to take him out of the garden because if he continues to eat of that, he's going to live. He was dying before he went into the garden. The changing of the seasons proves that there was death before the fall. If a season changed, my friends, then there had to be death. Do you suppose all of the animals were going to live forever? Was that God's plan? Every last little bee and every last little ant and every last little insect is going to just live forever and ever and ever and ever and ever? No. Death was good. It was created in the garden. It was good. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 23, Paul said, I want it. It's a good thing for me to die. I have a desire to depart. That was a good thing. Death is not to be feared. Physical death should be something that the Christian looks forward to. Oh, yes, I understand that uncertainty. We don't have time to go into that, but we should look forward to that. Now I'm going to try to answer all of these arguments, and I know that I can't. It's impossible in 20 minutes. So we'll do the best we can to get through these, because I have fun. We're going to camp on 1 Corinthians 15 for a good while. That's okay. We can go anywhere we want, because the Scriptures have the answer for us. Jesus was raised spiritually, not literally. Well, yes, I know he was raised physically. Jesus was raised physically out of that grave, and it was a sign. I want you to think about this. John chapter 20, what did John say about the sign of Jesus? He said, all of these things were done, written down, so that you may believe. Go here and look at this. And look at the context of this. And look at what had just been discussed. This is the empty tomb. This is the resurrection of Jesus. And what was this physical resurrection that I do not deny? It was a physical resurrection. It's the same thing that Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first 12 verses at least. He was talking about the preaching of the gospel and Jesus raising from the dead and the fact that he raised from the dead. And if he did it, then nobody else can. But what was Jesus' teaching on his physical resurrection? That it was a sign. These things were written. Why? So that you may believe. Now here's the simple fact of the matter. Jesus was not the first one to be raised from the dead. This sign, according to Matthew chapter 12, remember when these Pharisees and Sadducees were looking for a sign? And what did Jesus say? Well, this evil generation craves for a sign, but it's not going to get anything but the sign of Jonah. What is that? Resurrection, 3 days in the grave and then out. It was a physical resurrection, was the sign of something even more immense, and that's the defeat of death, or Thanatos, on the day of Jesus' resurrection when he came out of the Hadean realm. He defeated the grave. Do you not realize that the grave, let's see if I can find this here, is death? Look at this. Look at Hosea chapter 13 and verse 14. Can I get about a couple more hours for this point? Hosea 13:14 says, shall I redeem them? Let's look at, let me just get up. Shall I redeem them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them? Listen to this. What's Sheol? You know, I'm finding it amazing to realize that many members of the body of Christ have no clue what Sheol is. Preachers that have been standing in the pulpit for years and years and years cannot tell you what Sheol is. Well, they can tell you what the Hadean realm is. They can't tell you what Sheol is. Listen to this. It's death. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I ransom them from death? O death, and this is exactly what Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. O death, where are your thorns? And O Sheol, where's your sting? So what is death? Death and Sheol are the same thing. Hebrew parallelism. Hebrews spoke by paralleling. They'd say one thing, they'd come right back and say another thing a little differently, but the same meaning. Death and Sheol are the same thing. I see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 55. We could go to, here we go. Let's look at this. So all of these words, this is what Hades is. And this is what we see from the Old Testament and how it describes it. Hades is Sheol and death and the pit and destruction and flame of fire. Now, I want to make this point just quickly because these are all synonymous terms. We think every time we hear the word death, for example, that it means physical death. Your heart stops beating, you stop breathing, and they embalm you and put you to the ground. That is not always what death is. It is part of it. But they thought enough of the term death to translate it about, 32 times or something like that? I know there's lots of arguments to be made here, just trying to make this point. And you see this now. Was Paul talking about physical death, physical resurrection, bodily resurrection? He can't be if he doesn't use the term physical resurrection or bodily resurrection. Never once. Where Brother George was arguing, does he use the term physical resurrection or bodily resurrection? In the Greek, it's out from the dead ones. Ek nekron. He's coming out of Sheol. That was evidence. The physical resurrection was the evidence that he defeated the grave or Sheol. And then Paul's teaching was, if he didn't defeat the grave, well, let's just ask this question. Here's a question you need to answer, Brother George. What did Paul tell Timothy? 1 Timothy chapter 1? Let me get it. First Timothy, chapter 2 Timothy 1, verse 10. I'll get this straight. He says, but now has Jesus been revealed by the appearing of our Savior Jesus Christ, who abolished death. This is what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, that he abolished death, that he defeated death. We'll have more time to talk about this as we go along, but I'm just making the point, answering some of the arguments that he's made. 1 Peter 3 and verse 18 says in Young's literal that he was raised spiritually. Robert, can you bring that up for us since I don't carry Young's literal with me?
5 minutes, Charlie.
Okay. So look here at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18. Because also Christ once for sin did suffer, righteous for unrighteous, that he might lead us to God, having been put to death indeed in the flesh, and having been made alive in the spirit. And we look at Isaiah chapter 53, and we see that Jesus had to bear that punishment. What? In his soul. Look at it. In his soul. The last enemy to be defeated was death, physical death. So how are all of the dead raised? He got about verse 35. Do you realize that he asks the fool's question about this? How are the dead raised? Let me ask a question to myself. 1 Corinthians 15:35, someone will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? Here's your corporate body. Body singular, they plural. What kind of body do they come? You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. Now listen to this. And that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be. You will never rise again in your physical body. It is impossible because God did not will it that way. We can't find this physical, bodily resurrection for us. It was a sign for Jesus of him defeating the spiritual death, thanatos, the Greek word. You see what this means? My first affirmative. It'd be hard to answer. So what do we do with all of this? How do we look at all these things? Well, the simple fact of the matter is we have to look at the scriptures. We have to let the scriptures interpret the scriptures. You know, preachers can go to school and they can learn hermeneutics. And for the most part, they might get some of the things right, but what they're being taught to do, and then they come to our congregations and they teach us to do the exact same thing. You know what that is? To believe traditions. Now, I'm not saying that all of education is bad, but I am saying this. When a man teaches you something that's wrong, and then you teach someone else something that's wrong, how long is it going to take for that cycle to end? 2,000 years? Romans chapter 5 and verse 5 says, ready for this? Hope does not disappoint. Now, I want you to think about this. Was your grandma and grandpa disappointed when they went to their grave because Jesus didn't return, and they knew he was because the Bible was written to them, and it says that we are expecting him to come back anytime? They were disappointed by that hope. Tell you what, I have fulfillment. And I know that what Jesus said is 110% right. And when he said it, things like when he said what our topic was. I love this. Listen to what he says. These are the words of Jesus. And Jesus says, Matthew 16:27, the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels. And you show me that word is not mellow there, and it doesn't mean about to. And he's about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. That is judgment day. And everybody knows when Jesus comes, he's coming with his angels. It's judgment day and resurrection. We all know that. There's not a person in this room, I'm convinced, that doesn't believe when Jesus comes back, it's judgment and resurrection. And Jesus actually said when this was going to happen, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So I tell you that we must respect the scriptures. When Jesus says something, and when God says something, we better believe it. Like when you die, when I tell you you're going to die, you will surely die. And all we have to do is look at it logically and see that Adam did not fall physically dead. Guess what happened? He fell spiritually dead. He was kicked out of the garden and away from the tree of life, and he died about 900 years later. He died. He lived for a long time. God was making his point, wasn't he? But he still died. Physically, that 900 years later, but spiritually, he died that day. Are we going to believe his son when he says, I'm coming back soon for judgment with my angels and resurrection in your lifetime? Or are we going to twist the words of Christ? I don't know. How do we get around simple letting the scriptures interpret the scriptures? We got to be right up on it.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. What can I do in 30 seconds here? We talked about the graves. We talked about Necron, the end. I don't have time because I've come to the end. I'll hit that one next time around.